Welcome back. 2 weeks ago, we had our founding Congress of the Revolutionary Communists of America. Over the next few weeks on the podcast, we'll be going over exactly what we talked about at this Congress, the political perspectives and tasks of communists in the United States. And there's no better place to start than a general outlook on the political situation in the United States. Not only is this the country that we organize in, but it is the center of world imperialism. So without further ado, this is John Peterson on U.S. Perspectives.
All right, comrades, can you hear me? Okay, so I got a quick question for you all. How many of you are here because you are confident that capitalism can give you, your loved ones, and everyone you know, a beautiful, happy quality of life from here until eternity? Rough crowd. Anyway, as you've all noticed, capitalism is at an impasse. But luckily for us, the whole purpose of this weekend is to prepare for the third American Revolution. Are you ready to prepare for that, comrades? Yeah. All right. Now, it's not going to happen next week. Probably not going to happen next year even. May not even happen for another decade. But I am absolutely convinced that we will see another social revolution in this country in our lifetimes. So there can be no routinism in this discussion. This discussion, along with the World Perspectives discussion, is going to set the tone not just for the rest of this Congress, but for everything we do for the foreseeable future. Clear political analysis is the basis for everything that we do. And the only conclusion that Marxists can draw, if you look around the world and analyze things, is that revolution is humanity's only way out. Now, the aim of Perspectives is to make sense of the world that we live in, to anticipate the most likely course of events, and to prepare our forces to have a decisive impact on those events. And we do this while connecting the day-to-day struggles of ordinary workers with this bigger perspective of the need for the revolutionary transformation of social and property relations. And so my aim today is to inspire all of you to love connecting the events that we're living through with all this theory and history that we're always discussing, because they're intimately interconnected. It's that theory and that history that allows us to draw general conclusions about the class struggle and to fully appreciate the vast potential for societal change and to understand our role in those processes. So our perspectives are a working hypothesis, and as with all science, we have to consistently test those hypotheses against the march of events. And through a series of successive approximations, we can get ever closer to understanding the real nature of reality. Now, unfortunately, although we consider ourselves scientific socialists, we don't have the luxury of controlled laboratory conditions that can be artificially set up and repeated over and over, or they can just run these simulations on a supercomputer. We have to do this in real time. We have to do it in the real world, which is full of contradictions and is in infinite motion and change. So the point isn't to anticipate the future in exact detail, but rather to foresee the main variant or handful of variants so we can be politically, organizationally, and psychologically prepared to gain in quantity or at least quality no matter what actually happens. So like good investors, we need to determine which contingencies we need to prepare for so we can identify where we can get the biggest return on those investments of energy and money and time. And by return, for us, of course, we're talking about new contacts, new members, new cadre, more influence in the workers' movement, and more money and resources to expand our work even further. Now, I'd say that we have a pretty good track record here in the U.S. of outlining the broad stroke of events. I mean, were any of you really shocked that someone tried to assassinate Mr. Donald J. Trump? I don't think so. Or that stumbling, bumbling Genocide Joe was eventually forced to abandon his campaign? Obviously not. And the reason we're not taken by surprise is because these events track 100% with the main processes we've identified, followed, written about, and discussed for the last few decades as a political tendency. So we, as Marxists, we expect the unexpected, because in this epoch of decay and decline, there's always more chaos and instability around the corner. Always. I mean, you think you've seen it all with the debate, and then, it's more and more and more. And this is what we mean when we say that we live in an epoch of polarization and instability. As the bourgeois themselves have said, we're living in an omni-crisis or a perma-crisis. So what we have to do is understand those general processes. Now, sometimes it can seem as if it's just one unprecedented event after another. It's gotten so bad, honestly, that even the word unprecedented starts to lose a little bit of its meaning. But the point here is that this entire historical epoch is unprecedented. That's what unprecedented. Now, there's been a lot of tumultuous periods in human history. We've been around for thousands of years with class society, and even within the relatively brief history of capitalism itself, you've had some intense times. But the situation today is different, because this epoch is the transition between the capitalist and the communist modes of production. Not in over 100 years have we been so close to the end of capitalism on a world scale. Now, after the Russian Revolution, which was the greatest event in human history, after that failed to spread internationally, capitalism got another lease on life. The Great Depression, of course, gave the capitalists quite a big scare, but the betrayals of Stalinism in particular, and that really incredible rise of U.S. imperialism during and after World War II, laid the basis for a prolonged period of economic boom. And that blunted the edge of the class struggle and had a profound effect on mass consciousness. But nothing lasts forever, as we know, and the economy started coming to a grinding halt by the mid-1970s, and it opened up a new epoch of even deeper crisis and struggle. But then you had the collapse of the Soviet Union and the restoration of capitalism in Russia, Eastern Europe, China, and so on, and this gave capitalism another little life raft. But that raft is now deflated. The sharks are starting to circle, and the system has nowhere meaningful to go except Mars, maybe. And even that can't save them, although I'm sure a lot of us would like to send some of these individuals off to Mars. So most of us, our entire lives, we've known nothing but crisis and instability. This last half century has been one of constant decay, constant decline, of hyper-alienation, of mass shootings, of mass depression. It's gotten so bad that according to the World Health Organization, within 2 decades, depression will be second only to cardiovascular disease in terms of worldwide non-fatal disease burden. And yet, the wealth of society has never been so vast. The ruling class has rarely been so weak, and the working class has never been so numerically strong. So the potential for a world of genuine superabundance, a worker state, and the socialist transition from capitalism to moneyless, classless, stateless communism has never been greater. But due to a lack of revolutionary leadership, that contradiction is not going to be resolved overnight. We're doing important work, but we're certainly not big enough yet. So this period we're living through, it's still the early stages of the greatest storm in human history, the most momentous transition our species has ever had to experience. And so yes, it's going to be messy, it's going to be chaotic, but we have the benefit of Marxist theory. We have the benefit of having studied the rich history of class struggle across the ages, and in particular over the last 200 years. And we have an international which quickly analyzes world events as they happen, which allows us a lot of confidence in understanding what's happening. So personally, I'm not disconcerted by any of this. I actually take quite a lot of joy by watching this whole process unfold. Long before the founding of this country, an intimately connected chain of events was already in motion, you could say, that has led to this convergent history. So I actually take pleasure, intellectual pleasure, in understanding just what the hell is happening in this world, of being able to recognize all these interconnections and the fundamental dynamics of those processes. I feel anchored in the middle of the storm because I understand my place in it, and above all, I understand the role and the place of the RCI and the RCA in all of this. Because as individuals, we're absolutely hopeless to change anything. but as part of a revolutionary party, as part of a politically motivated and theoretically sharpened tool that has been created consciously to smash capitalism, we can and will change the course of history. Now, even a super voluntarist like Donald Trump can't impose his will on the historical process. Without the systemic crisis of capitalism, the endless crimes and betrayals of the Democrats and the labor leaders, and the distorted polarization and anger that this has led to, he wouldn't have a leg to stand on. And it's those same conditions, by the way, in which the exploitation and the oppression which are inherent to capitalism, they've been taken to the nth degree due to the belated nature, due to the delay of the world revolution, that this new generation of communists has emerged. And so our task is to win tens of thousands of them to our ideas, our program, perspectives, methods, and traditions. Because it's not enough to just self-identify as a communist, although that's a good and important starting point, but communists need both ideas and organization. And if we're going to have a real impact on history, we need hundreds and then thousands of trained cadres that can actually understand all of this, who can then train tens of thousands more people in the years ahead. And to do that, we need a deep and nuanced understanding of Marxist theory, history, and perspectives. I was so happy this morning to see the line out the door, practically out the door, to people buying big stacks of books. That really is essential for the future. And so what we need to do, each of us individually and also ourselves collectively as a political tendency, is to go back to the fundamentals. We have to go back to the fundamentals of the class struggle, the economy, and this broad historical process. We have to be able to explain how the capitalist mode of production, it's long past its sell-by date, and the nation state and the market economy are the main barriers to further human progress. These have to be replaced by an international planned economy that can harness our species and our planet's full potential. Now, we need to explain to people, and we got to start with understanding this ourselves, the mechanics of exploitation under capitalism and how oppression is a function of that. We need to understand what classes are, what the main classes in US society are, and how the different relations of these classes to the means of production lead to the need for political and organizational class independence. We need to be able to explain the fundamentals of bourgeois politics, how the Democrats and Republicans are in essence the same party. They're the party of property, and that they have two right wings. We need to make it clear that the reformists, the so-called liberal socialists, and the progressive wing of the bourgeoisie are doomed by the fact that they limit themselves to capitalism. We need to be able to explain what Trumpism is and what it isn't. And we should highlight the fact that despite all the confusion out there, the class balance of forces has never been so overwhelmingly in favor of the workers. And there's no doubt about that. I mean, the number of workers in society on a world scale and in the United States is bigger than ever. But as we know, without a bold revolutionary leadership, without class struggle trade unionism, that political vacuum is being filled temporarily by demagogic populists of various types, and in particular, by far-right populists. We need to be able to explain how the US came to be in the position it is, that it's had a privileged position on a world scale since it was founded, and even more so since World War II, and even more so after that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, which led to this period of undisputed imperialist domination. But that's over now. That's all finished. We've been plunged once again, whether we like it or not, into a world of revolution, of crisis, of counter-revolution. So we need to go back to those fundamentals. We have to explain, what is the economic cycle? How does the stock market work? What about inflation, unemployment, homelessness? And why is it that the quality of life is collapsing? And of course, extremely important, we need to go to the fundamentals of Marxist philosophy, of dialectical materialism, which is our most powerful tool of analysis. Maybe more than anything, though, we need to explain what a revolution is. That seems like a simple question, but we need to be able to explain in detail, while at the same time not making it too complicated, what a revolution is, why we see one on the horizon, and why we need to have a sense of urgency in preparing for it. So in other words, we have to use facts, figures, and arguments to bring the fundamentals of Marxism to life. It's those fundamentals that allows us to place all the details into the proper context and to understand the situation we're passing through so we can prioritize our work. It's the core of our analysis, and without it, everything else is just undifferentiated random noise. Now, if we do this, we will be able to connect with those young communists and those older communists that are coming out of the woodwork these days, who are looking, again, not only for action, but for answers. We need to understand the conditions that shaped the consciousness of these millions of people. We need to merge our small forces with the best elements and grow into a truly large and powerful force where we can fill all the different venues in this space here in Philadelphia and become, again, an actual factor in the historical process. So let's take a look at some of the elements, some of those factors that are driving these dramatic changes in consciousness, starting with the economic situation, which is a crisis that's been accelerating with ebbs and flows ever since, in particular since 2008. Now, Joe Biden, you've heard of him, he based a big part of his campaign on the idea that the US economy is the envy of the world. He couldn't understand why the most pro-union president in US history wasn't just cruising unopposed to re-election. But the reality on the ground is very different, as we all know. The consumer price index has increased nearly 21% since the start of the pandemic. A typical household, it was found just a couple of days ago, a typical household has to spend $925 more every month to buy the same goods and services that they bought 3 years ago. 39% of US adults say they worry most or all of the time that their family's income won't be enough to meet expenses. That's up from 28% in December 2021 in the middle of the pandemic. And that's even more than the 37% we saw during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. 35% of Americans say they've had to take on extra work to pay the bills. Since 2019, rents have grown faster than wages in 44 of 50 major metropolitan areas. In 2023 alone, in New York City, rents grew 7 times faster than wages. Consumer spending is a big deal in this country. It accounts for 68% of GDP. And of course, if people have to spend more money on things like rent, then they don't have money to buy other things. Now, inflation has come down a little bit in recent weeks, but the damage has been done, and it's just too little, too late. Even if prices aren't going up as quickly as they were a couple of years ago, they remain historically high. And so to make ends meet, workers have had to raid their savings, if they have any, or to turn to credit. And the credit is a way that the capitalists are able to expand the market temporarily, artificially, beyond the normal bounds of the market. But as one long-term unemployed worker put it recently, said, it's sort of like grabbing a few pennies out of a piggy bank every few days, and eventually that piggy bank weighs a little lighter. And there seem to be more days ahead than there are pennies. That's dialectics right there, comrades. That's quantity turning into quality. Now, 32% of Gen Z and 31% of millennials have less than $1,000 in savings. And remember, these are the good times. This is not the recession. Just wait until the next technical recession actually hits. So consumer debt has now hit yet another record of $18 trillion. The numbers are so big you can hardly make sense of them, right? In May of this year, just a couple months ago, Americans added over $11 billion in what they owe on credit cards, on auto, and student loans. And the average consumer household debt is now over $100,000. As an analyst at Bankrate put it, people are definitely spending. That's supporting the economy. But it's not good to the extent that many of these cardholders are paying an average interest of over 20%. And that's the catch, of course. All of that debt has to be paid back eventually with interest. That means so that once you've spent the money that you've borrowed, you have to make enough money to cover your basic expenses, plus a significant percentage above that to just pay the interest on the debt that you've got. But almost nobody's getting raises of 20% or more to keep up with that. And this applies not only to individuals, but also to governments. The US national debt, the federal debt, It's predicted to top $56 trillion over the next 10 years, with the debt to GDP ratio, which is an important indicator of the health of the national economy. They expect it to rise from 99% this year to 122% in 2034. Now, this year, this blows my mind, but this year alone, the U.S. federal government is going to spend $892 billion on interest payments alone. That's more than the official defense budget. That's hundreds of billions of dollars in virtually free money to the banks, which are like vampires sucking up ever more of the unpaid labor of the working class. And yet they tell us that there's no money for essential social programs like healthcare and education. Now, the annual federal budget, how much the government brings in taxes and other resources, and how much they spend, this year, the deficit is projected to be $1.9 trillion. That means that in a single year, the government's going to spend nearly $6,000 more per person living here than they bring in. That means that each and every one of you is going into debt by an additional $500 every single month, and you have zero say about it, and you're going to see virtually nothing in exchange for that money. And they use this money to prop up scumbags like Zelensky and Netanyahu. Now, on a world scale, governments owe $91 trillion in debt, which is almost equivalent to the entire world economy. And so now we're being told that, quote, governments will have to make hard choices that could be very consequential for people's lives. Now that's just code language for cuts, attacks, austerity on a scale that's going to dwarf anything that we've seen anywhere. And if you look at what happened in Kenya, if you look at what happened in Sri Lanka, if you look at what happened, a decade ago in Greece, you know where these processes lead to. Now, the problem is that the only way to sort of get ahead of those payments, to get ahead of that interest, to get ahead of all of this, is to expand the economy more quickly or to raise more tax revenues. And either of those can only happen by squeezing the workers even harder. And yet, according to the IMF, they just said last week that the U.S. economy is growing slower than expected, and that the labor market is already starting to cool. So what's going to happen when you have an actual recession, and not these good old times we're living in now, but an actual recession with mass layoffs, people losing their homes, people losing their cars, and so on. Now, when you take inflation out of the equation, let's imagine there was no inflation, then more or less wages have grown by about 1.5% over the last 4 years. Of course, that's an average. There's a lot of people whose wages have been completely gutted by inflation because they haven't received much of an increase. So that's an average. That doesn't count for everybody. But the situation is even more glaring when you compare that 1.5% in wage increases, inflation adjusted, if you will, to how much GDP grew over the last 4 years, which is by 7%. So 7%, I'm not very good at math, but 7% minus 1.5% is quite a lot of wealth that's been generated just in this country over the last few years. And it's kind of a mystery where that money went. Do any of you have any idea where the money went? No? Well, in March of 2020, the U.S. had 614 billionaires with a combined wealth of $2.95 trillion. 4 years later, the country now has 737 billionaires with a combined wealth of $5.53 trillion, an increase of nearly 88% over just 4 years. Elon Musk's wealth has grown from $25 billion 4 years ago to about $190 billion, 7 times more money. In 2020, Jeff Bezos was the only centibillionaire who had $100 billion or more. Today, the entire top 10 richest Americans are all centibillionaires, and these 10 people have a combined wealth of $1.4 trillion. Now, on a world scale, to put it into context, the 5 richest men in the world have more than doubled their fortunes since 2020 at a rate of, guess what? Guess how much they make? $14 million per hour these people make. They don't make it, that's what they suck in. While the 5 billion poorest people on the planet have gotten poorer. So, for most Americans, the Biden years have been years of declining living standards, to say the least, and it's little wonder that they're so pissed off. So a big part of Trump's appeal is just good old-fashioned pragmatism and wishful thinking. He's updated his Make America Great slogan. He's updated that, and now he says that he's going to make America wealthy once again, which sounds pretty good when you're not doing so well. Now, how he's going to do that is a mystery, of course, but we shouldn't be surprised if he makes, or if he has his vice president make these demagogic attacks against Wall Street to keep up those populist credentials. But the reality is that the capitalists are between a rock and a hard place. We've talked about this before, but labor productivity historically has been trending downward. That's how much value workers create on average per hour of labor, while wages have been creeping upward. And in the first quarter of this year, the first 3 months of this year, which is the most recent quarter that they had data for, non-farm business sector labor productivity, as they call it, increased by just 0.2%. So productivity increased by 0.2%, but hourly compensation, more or less wages and salary, rose by 4.2%. So it's cost the capitalists about 4% more in labor costs and paying for that labor power. At the same time, in the first quarter, corporate profits fell by 2.7%. So in other words, the wages are too high for the capitalists because it's cutting into their profits, but it's certainly way too low for the workers because it can't keep up with inflation. Now that is a finished recipe for the intensification of the class struggle, with or without all the smoke and mirrors of this election year and all these promises of a return to mythical greatness. So there's a lot more that could be said about the economy. We talked a bit about it this morning, about immigration, about climate change, about Gaza, Ukraine, about the shifting balance of imperialist power and this relative decline of U.S. imperialism, which is something very important to bear in mind. This question of globalization, or the reversal of global trade, this ongoing trade war between the U.S. and China and Europe, and how all of this is affecting the U.S. But I think what I've covered so far should suffice to make it clear why people are so angry, frustrated, and desperate for some kind of real change. And this then is the basis. This is the fundamental basis for this profound political crisis that we're witnessing. As we know, I hope we know, that politics is concentrated economics, and economics is ultimately concentrated class struggle. So what we're seeing in politics isn't just a question of personalities or of political infighting or of just disagreements over what to do at this or that stage of the economic cycle. It's organic. It's hard-baked into capitalism, and there's no way out on the basis of this system. And so that's why we call this a systemic crisis, or we call it a crisis of the regime. Now, how many of you tuned into the Biden-Trump debate or saw it shortly after? That was pretty pathetic, right? I mean, but that spectacle was really just one concrete example of the senile decay of the system and the lack of options. You better believe if they could come up with another Obama or another JFK or someone who can at least string sentences together, they would try. Obviously, they've been forced to make a change. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the bottom line is that they don't have a lot of options. And as one historian said after that debate, he said, "I am worried about the image projected to the outside world. It's not an image of leadership, it's an image of terminal decline." And Trotsky could have written those words a few decades ago, and it's 100% correct. So I think it's worth remembering the extremely prescient words of Comrade Ted Grant, what he said after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union for decades, despite its problems, was a counterbalance to untrammeled capitalism, and untrammeled American capitalism in particular. And Ted said that although this collapse, the fall of the USSR, was a world historic defeat for the working class, it nevertheless was merely the prelude to another even greater historical drama, which was the epoch of the terminal decline and fall of capitalism. So comrades, what we're living through right now are the birth pangs of the old society, which is pregnant with the new, and the new society can be birthed only through revolution. And as any mother can tell you, or anyone who works with mothers or with babies, childbirth can be painful, it can be prolonged, it can be a bloody process, especially when the baby is long overdue, which is what we're dealing with. So what is a revolution? Let's at least look at that quickly. Now, a revolution, it represents the culmination of a period of intensifying class antagonisms and these overlapping economic, social, and political crises. The ruling class is divided, and they're unable to rule in the old way. The middle layers of society are crushed by the weight of the crisis, and they're desperate to find a way out. And the working class, which is living in increasingly intolerable conditions, it draws the conclusion en masse that the only way out is to rise up and to fight. The workers become aware of their colossal power, of their common interests, not as individuals, but as a class. And they surge into this opening at the top that's been left by the ruling class, who are fighting amongst themselves. The workers surge through that breach, and they seize their destiny in their hands. And very often they set up revolutionary committees or organs, elements of dual power, as we call them, like the Soviets in Russia, or the Shuras in Iran, or the Cabildo Abierto in Bolivia. And so as Trotsky put it, the most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. And I think it's pretty clear that we're seeing the early stages of this process unfolding right before our eyes. But of course, those of us here, we're here because we know that there's another essential factor that's needed if we're going to lead not only to a revolution, but to its victory and to its consolidation. We've seen quite a few revolutions. I mean, even some of you have only been members for a few months, and yet you've already seen, embryos of revolution in places like Kenya. I mean, they're not that uncommon, but victorious revolutions are very, very, very rare. And what's needed is that a section of the workers be organized politically, armed with Marxist ideas and class struggle, class-independent methods, that we have thousands of cadres rooted in our class so that we can serve as a catalyst for that process, as a transmission belt, as Bolshevik drill sergeants for training up millions of revolutionary fighters in quick order when the moment of the actual uprising starts to approach. So that's why we say we need a party with a far-sighted Marxist leadership that's looking well ahead, not just what happened last week, but what's likely to happen months and years and even decades in the future. A leadership that's steeled and that's willing to take the revolution to its logical conclusion, which is the establishment of a workers' state and the overthrow of capitalist property relations. Now, obviously, there's a little bit more to it than that, but that is a thumbnail sketch of a revolution, and that broad historical vision is what should inspire us in our daily work. We have to keep that in mind. That's the goal. That's what's coming. Because revolutions aren't only possible under capitalism, they're inevitable. And since the U.S., last I checked, it's a capitalist country, therefore, that applies to this country as well, although obviously the American Revolution, it's going to have its own rhythms, its own characteristics. But it's this glaring contradiction that people can see between the self-evident potential for a rational society and the reality that most of us are stuck in, that it's whipsawing people's consciousness in every possible direction, from communism and yes, also to fascism. But despite all these cross currents that we're seeing, who can deny that we're beginning to see a revolutionary awakening on a mass scale? That's what's happening, and part of that process is this undermining of confidence in the institutions that have ruled this country, if not for decades, for centuries. Now, a recent poll of 18 to 19-year-olds conducted by Harvard, it found that confidence in public institutions continues to decline. Even the military, which had long been the most trusted of those institutions. Most people know someone that's in the military, a sibling or an uncle or a grandpa or whatever that's been in the military. So it tends to have pretty high confidence. But the military has seen a 10-point drop in confidence over just the last 12 months. Since 2015, so roughly in the last decade or so, they track these things, trust in the presidency, the office of the presidency, it's fallen from 80% 10 years ago to 20% are confident in the presidency. Trust in the Supreme Court fell by 55% and is now at 24%. Trust in Wall Street is down 43%. It's at 9%. Surprise, surprise. Trust in Congress is down 34%. It's now at 12%. I don't know how it beat Wall Street, but and trust in the media, this is interesting, is down 18% and it's at just 10%. So only 9% of young Americans say that the country is headed generally headed in the right direction, and economic questions, unsurprisingly, are the top concern among all Americans, including the youth. Now, 41% of Americans think civil war is inevitable in the next 5 years. I don't know what they mean by civil war, but it wasn't like that a couple decades ago. And 20% of Americans think that violence is not only likely, but necessary to get the country back on track. So, I mean, it really is incredible how quickly things are starting to unravel for the ruling class. And they have no way of reestablishing a lasting and meaningful equilibrium, because everything they do to establish political or social or economic equilibrium is this going to unbalance other aspects of this very complex equation of governing millions and ultimately billions of people under their system. Now, the Pax Romana in ancient Rome lasted for about 200 years. The American version lasted barely 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. And honestly, can any of you see how this thing can just keep on going another 30 years as they are? How many of you are confident in that? No, yeah. Anyway, so look, comrades, we predicted some time ago, because this weighs very heavily on people's minds. I mean, this is a pretty bleak situation that you could draw, the conclusion you could draw from this. And we predicted that all this desperation and lack of alternatives could lead to some moods of individual terrorism or neuroticism. We saw glimpses of that with Aaron Bushnell's martyrdom, and now with the Trump assassination attempt. But I'm still confident that the sheer gravity of the common interests of the working class will eventually assert itself, and it's going to cut across the disorientation and all these efforts to rule us and to divide us on the basis of identity politics. So another really important part of our perspectives is the question of the labor movement. Now, there's been some really interesting developments in the last few years, from Starbucks to Amazon to the United Auto Workers and their president, Sean Fain, essentially calling for the preparation of a potential general strike for May Day 2028. And although some labor leaders and some rank and file workers have come out for Trump, if he does get back into power, the reality of his policies in practice is going to be quite a different matter, especially if the inevitable next economic downturn happens to him. Last time he was able to blame COVID for what happened. It seems like so far, the bourgeois have dodged that bullet. I think like 75% of bourgeois analysts last year thought we would have had a recession by now. Somehow it hasn't happened, but it's built into the system. There will be a recession, and if it doesn't hit before the elections, it's probably going to hit when Trump is president. So I think we're going to see an even bigger uptick in labor struggle. So far this year, there's been 173 labor actions at 232 different locations. That's a little bit slower of a pace than we saw last year, but it's still pretty significant. And I think we really have to highlight the strike in California against the repression of the pro-Palestinian protests, which was the first overtly political strike of any real importance in a very long time. Now, given lack of time and a lot of other things I want to cover, perhaps other comrades can come in to talk about the state of the labor movement. But suffice it to say that the American working class, it's far from defeated. It hasn't been crushed in a whole series of battles, and it's still just waking up after decades of hibernation. So no matter who wins the presidency, the capitalist crisis ain't going anywhere, and the workers are going to have to band together to fight back against the bosses. So there's a lot of confusion in this country, as we all know, and I think it's going to be a little while at least before an unambiguous working class consciousness really crystallizes on a mass scale. But remember, that can crystallize very quickly once that process reaches a certain threshold. But I think it won't surprise comrades to find that 54% of Americans still identify as middle class, whatever that means. But 31% consider themselves working class, and 12% consider themselves lower class. So 31% working class, 12% lower class. That's quite a bit different than you would have gotten if you asked this question a couple of decades ago. And just 2% see themselves as upper class, and that's probably more or less accurate. But the biggest change, and I think the most interesting change in the polling is this, is that things have gone so bad now for the liberals that after decades of being able to pose as the worker-friendly lesser evil, the Democrats are now seen as the party of war, inflation, and crisis, which of course they are. But people don't see them as the natural go-to because you just have to vote for them as the lesser evil. Up until 2020, just a couple years ago, Republicans were more likely to identify as middle class than Democrats. Now, Republicans are more likely to view themselves as working or lower class. Now, again, what they mean by that, it isn't exactly clear, but that is significant. Now, as Marxists, we can't be confused as to what class is. We have to understand what class is, and we have to be able to explain it. So for scientific socialists, which class you fall into isn't just sort of a self-appraisal, and it's not merely an identity that you apply to yourself. It's a function of your relationship to the means of production. And in this world, there are those who own the means of production, and they buy labor power to work those means of production. And there's those who have nothing but their ability to work for sale, so they got to sell their ability to work for a wage or a salary if they want to survive. So you have buyers of labor power and sellers of labor power. You have exploiters and you have exploited. And really, the class struggle is nothing more than the struggle over the surplus product produced by the laboring classes. And under capitalism, this takes the form of the struggle over surplus value, which is the wealth that's generated by the workers during the labor process above and beyond what they receive back in wages, benefits, or any other sorts of bonuses or deferred wages like retirement plans and so on. So understanding those fundamentals of Marxist theory, it's essential not just to make sense of the world, but so we can identify ways of intervening in it, like our comrades at the Minneapolis airport did, armed with an understanding of the basic dynamics of class exploitation. That theory, it's also very important if we're going to resist the enormous pressures that are being put on us to buy into the prevailing ideology of this age, which is the ideology of the ruling class. We're told, despite everything, that this is the best of all possible worlds, that we're all on Team America, it's the same team, national unity, class collaboration. But it's precisely because we understand the class nature of this world that we reject class collaboration at the workplace and in politics. It's that simple. Now, the Republicans, they're cynically, it really is incredible to watch this, they're cynically building this new unholy class collaborationist alliance, and they're posing as the party of the working class. Obviously, they're not the party of the working class, but in a country of 150 million people, the bourgeois can only win elections if they dupe different layers of workers into voting for them. And so that's why the RNC had union leaders stumping for Trump, including the president of the Teamsters. You had Bobby Bartles, the business manager of Steamfitters Local 638. That's Comrade Dave Johnson's union here in New York, stumping for Trump. And this explains, of course, the choice of J.D. Vance as a vice presidential nominee, even though he called Trump the American Hitler a few years ago. Now, leaning on the roots he has in Appalachia, Vance, he's even embraced class war rhetoric as part of this populist appeal. When he accepted the nomination for vice president, he said, "We're done, ladies and gentlemen, catering to Wall Street barons. We'll commit to the working man." If you think that's not demagogy, I don't know what is. But they obviously think that if they can win these elections by nominating such a young guy, that they've got things sewn up for the foreseeable future, right? Even if they do win, it of course wouldn't mean that the Republicans would be in power forever. They can't square the circle of capitalism, and it doesn't help that Vance is a real hardliner on the question of abortion. But after the disaster of Genocide Joe, if Harris can't pull it off, it might be a little while before the Democrats get back in, if they ever get back in. But they could get back in, because unless and until a mass class-independent alternative emerges, we can't write these parties off. The Democratic Party won't be dead and buried until the workers consciously drive a stake through its heart, because these are institutional parties, and they've got power and tentacles all throughout society that go well beyond their top candidates. So Trump, I think this is worth discussing a little bit, how Trump succeeded in doing what he did in the Republicans. Because remember, after George W. Bush, a lot of people said that the Republicans were unelectable. They could never come to power again. But by using nationalism, xenophobia, Trump has reframed the issues, and he's sort of created a new us versus them framework for looking at the world. You know, he tapped into the anger and the bruised egos of those millions of Americans who, their identity as the undisputed best and greatest in the world, it's been battered in recent decades, not to mention the fact that their savings accounts and their checking accounts have also been pretty beat up. And so we saw the beginnings of this with the Tea Party during the Obama years. And instead of traditional conservatives versus traditional liberals, Trump poses it as a battle between American workers, manufacturing, jobs, and prosperity against China, against immigrant job stealers, and effete establishment elites. It's a war, in his view, between those who want to put America first and they want to make it great and wealthy again, and those who would roll over when America is under attack, when it's being invaded by people who don't have a right to be here and who don't play fair. It's a fight, he says, between those who work hard and those people who freeload. It's between law and order and dangerous communist criminals, which is what the majority of the population appears to be in his view. And this is what explains his appeal amongst some layers of Black, Latino, and other workers, young people. Even before Biden dropped out, Trump actually was more popular among people under 30 than Biden was, because it's what he says. It's not about racism as such. It's more about reframing who is the we and who is the them. And for decades, the Democrats were able to rely on the support of these historically oppressed populations because they were repelled by the overt racism of the traditional Republicans. But Trump has used this economic nationalism to appeal to all kinds of people who are dissatisfied with life under the liberals. I mean, these are American pragmatists, after all, whether they're Black, Latino, Asian, white, or anything else. And remember, over the last 16 years or so, the Democrats have been in power for 12 years, and Trump was only in power for 4. So people know more what it's like to live under liberals than what it is to live under Republicans. So this the chaos that Trump is causing, we understand that it's not really him doing it, that he's more the catalyst than the root cause. And the liberals have proven that they're basically unable to stop him. They may be able to stop him at the polls, but they can't end Trumpism. They can't take Trumpism out at its roots, despite all the fear-mongering about fascism and so on. And so watching politics these days, American politics used to be so boring, you wouldn't even bother caring what was happening. Now, I mean, it's like watching a slow motion train wreck into this dumpster fire, and it's actually pretty exciting, and pretty fun. And Trump, he's a sociopath. He's a liar. I mean, it's amazing, the things that come out of this guy's mouth. I wonder what his, psychological profile. Well, it doesn't take a lot to guess what his psychological profile is. But it's precisely because of this that he's actually a more honest reflection of what capitalism really is. He's a champion, basically, of a world in which the fittest, survival of the fittest, and everybody else just gets trampled. He promises the chosen few who follow him that they will be richly rewarded. He says he's their warrior, he's their justice, he's their retribution. And this is an overtly messianic message that, if you watch the RNC, it had his true followers just like in raptures. They believe that God stopped the assassination because he has a greater plan for Donald Trump, and that's to save America from people like us. But of course, all of this is gonna lead to a big backlash by those people who are about to get trampled by these people. So the whip of counter-revolution always leads to a response on behalf of the masses, and it should always lead to a strengthening of the resolve of the true revolutionaries. Because you better believe after that assassination attempt, any anti-Trump protests are going to be much more polarized. They're going to be much more potentially violent. I wouldn't even be surprised if some of the people who were at the Capitol on January 6th are now out in front of the White House defending their beloved president against the vermin and the enemy inside and all this kind of stuff that they say, who will now be on the right side of the state. But I think we should be clear again that what we're seeing in American society isn't so much a shift to the right as the non-existence of the left. The Democrats are effectively the center-right in bourgeois politics, and the Republicans are the far right. And then, of course, you have the extreme right beyond that. But there's no real left to speak of, and the labor leaders are in bed with the class enemy of both parties. Meanwhile, the far right, they do have a lot of money. They're very well funded. They're quite well organized. And so as a result, within the limited parameters of American bourgeois politics, this polarization away from the center that's collapsing, it's leading to people who are going towards the right, finding people like Trump, whereas people moving towards the left don't really find much of anything because we're simply not big enough. Millions of people, I think, are dropping out of mainstream politics, or they're just sort of zigzagging one way or another without a clear political compass. Let's be honest. For a lot of people, a billionaire alpha male who likes cage fighting, he dodges bullets, he talks about the American Revolution, and he promises to drain the swamp and make you rich, it's going to compare pretty favorably to a career hack like Biden or a former state attorney general like Harris. Americans love fights. They love fighters. It's a violent country, whether you like it or not. But they love winners even more than underdogs, and Trump's both an underdog and a winner. And, I think you're going to see a lot of people joining that bandwagon. Biden's campaign was basically sunk before it even begun. Only 18% of people said that they felt better off financially under Biden than before Biden. And 49% said that they felt worse off. So that right there, that's game over. Americans, again, they're pragmatists, if nothing else. And since there are no fundamentally different options, lots of people are going to go for whatever they think is going to be best for them in the short term. But let's not forget, 63% of Americans in a recent poll said they think a third major party is needed. That's unfortunately, we don't have such a party yet, but it shows you the potential for something like that. Now, I think, though, in a convoluted way, you could say that Trump has, in effect, created a new party within the shell of the Republicans. Back in 2016, we didn't rule out that Bernie could theoretically do something similar with the Democrats, i.e. fill the old party shell with radical socialist content. It looked like he was going to win the nomination in the early running, but Sanders doesn't have 1/millionth the tenacity or the ego or even the integrity, as reactionary as it is, as Trump does, and of course he capitulated to the party establishment. Trump, on the other hand, he's succeeded in this hostile takeover of the party of Abraham Lincoln, of Richard Nixon, and the Bush dynasty. So on a lot of issues, J.D. Vance sounds more like Bernie Sanders than a traditional Republican. And, so the Republican Party is one hell of a Frankenstein party right now. It's this crazy big tent where you have union leaders, the pro-abortion founder of Slutwalk. They share the stage with religious fundamentalists, Hulk Hogan and Tucker Carlson. They're all in this big tent. And of course, people tend to see in politicians what they want to see, and that's especially true in someone who's bigger than life, like the Donald. So, what did Trump victory mean that we're living under the jackboot of fascism? Well, it's true that he just said, I think yesterday, to some Christian gathering, he said, "You won't have to vote anymore after 2024, my beautiful Christians, because everything is going to be so nice, they're not going to need to vote anymore. He's going to fix everything," and he loves his beautiful Christians. But he's going to try to consolidate executive power in a way we've rarely seen in this country under the pressure of the crisis and ultimately under the pressure of the working class. The ruling class has to have more centralized power, and that's why they're moving more towards what's called an imperial presidency. The Supreme Court has basically granted blanket immunity to the presidency. There's very few checks and balances anymore. Trump has promised to purge the federal government of the so-called deep state. He says he's going to use the Justice Department to go after his rivals. He basically wants to set himself up as a new version of Tammany Hall, with himself as Boss Tweed, kind of receiving favors and handing out favors like the Godfather. But all of this can only undermine the rule of law. And of course, if he wants to smash the so-called deep state and set up a Trumpite meritocracy, he's going to have to go after the government unions, which are some of the strongest unions actually in the country, with workers who have pretty good protections and wages. Now, we've all heard of Project 2025. I don't have time to go into it. Hopefully someone else could come in on that. But the bottom line is, it's not a blueprint for fascism. And these people, what they're worried about is that there's going to be resistance to this. The people who wrote this thing, the Heritage Foundation, the president of the Heritage Foundation said just this month that if basically if people don't roll over and accept these plans, that, quote, "we are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be." Now, leaving aside his misunderstanding of the term revolution, it's clear that they're worried that things could get out of hand. And there just aren't enough police or National Guard members to hold everybody down. So the bottom line is, Trump, if he wins, isn't going to have a super solid mandate. Remember, before Biden walked out, 82% said of registered voters 18 to 49 years old said they would replace both Trump and Biden. Before the debate, 70% said that Trump was also too old to be president. So that's hardly a vote of confidence. But the point isn't that Biden performed badly in that debate. It's that he was totally unable to perform. I mean, even a 6-year-old could understand that that person had no business being president. And the problem is that capitalism as a system no longer has a historical mission. It's no longer in its prime, and the candidates, of course, reflect that. That relative stability of the post-war period is gone, and the ruling class has started to lose control of its institutions, like the Supreme Court, the Republican Party, and it's pretty scary what's going on there. And yet, we still see the so-called squad, Bernie Sanders, AOC, these people circle the wagons to defend Biden to the bitter end. And I think most of you weren't around probably during the heyday of DSA, but it's really a condemnation of the so-called strategy of working within the Democratic Party to try to push it or pressure it to the left. What we said would happen is exactly what happened, that instead of pushing the Democrats to the left, these people would get sucked right into the Democratic Party, and that's exactly what's happened. Now, as we know, Harris is now the candidate. It's basically, it's been decided. They haven't had the DNC yet, but we're going to still be there in Chicago protesting, and maybe we can see some Hollywood stars as well coming to sing her praises. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of doubts about this, about her candidacy within the Democrats. It remains to be seen who her vice presidential candidate's going to be. I think, they're saying there's some interesting strategic options as far as maybe winning some of those swing states. But who knows? Maybe just a new face, any face, can inject some enthusiasm into the Democratic base. They reported that within 24 hours of her becoming the candidate, 28,000 people signed up to volunteer, and 888,000 donors contributed $81 million, which was a record for campaign funding. And we saw that before Biden dropped out, in every battleground state where there was a Senate seat up for grabs, the Democratic candidate was winning, even if Biden was losing. So although Trump might be a little bit less unpopular than the extremely unpopular Biden, it doesn't mean that Americans are just drinking the orange Kool-Aid of Donald Trump. And it really is unprecedented for a major party to swap out its candidate just a few weeks before the election, just a few months before their convention and the election, especially when it's the incumbent party and the guy running is the guy who beat the other guy in the last election. I mean, it really is crazy. Abraham Lincoln allegedly said that when it comes to presidential campaigns, you shouldn't change horses in midstream. But in this case, the horse's leg was broken, and it was drowning in this raging river, and they had to get him out of there. So they used to say that a week is a long time in politics. But these days, even a day, even an hour, I mean, I'm worried to see what's happened since I started talking. Something crazy I might have totally missed something because events are moving so quickly. So we should never say never. We shouldn't say, oh, there's no way the Democrats can win. We shouldn't be overly categorical when it comes to things like predicting the exact results of wars or economic cycles or elections. And I'd say everything right now is up in the air. RFK is in the mix as well, who's polling above the margin of error, although he's apparently been in talks with Trump about endorsing him in exchange for some position in his administration. But when you consider abstention and disenfranchisement and the fact that the president isn't elected by the popular vote, but through the Electoral College, it may turn out that less than a quarter of the population actually wants whoever wins to be the president. And so as we often say, the workers are going to lose, that's guaranteed. The capitalists are going to win, that's guaranteed. But we also stand to make tremendous gains, no matter what the result is. There's a reason why the conservative columnist Bret Stephens, he recently wrote that Republicans should be careful what they ask for if Trump is elected. As he says, Trump won't slay the left. Instead, he will re-energize and radicalize it. In other words, he can see that Trump will be seen by millions of people for what he is, which is the whip of counter-revolution. And he can't deliver on his big promises either, because he can't impose his will on the market, on inflation, or on the world economy. He poses a serious danger to the lives, the livelihoods, and the dignity of millions of people in this country and billions of people around the world. And after what we saw after he was elected in 2016, after the George Floyd uprising of 2020, and the Gaza Solidarity Movement, which will likely reignite in the coming weeks when the campuses come back, you could see that if Trump does win, there's going to be a massive uptick in the class struggle, in the protest movement. And that's likely, if he's president, to be met with even more violence, with more attacks by paramilitary thugs. That's going to radicalize the movement further. Are the youth, are the radicalized youth going to stand idly by while hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants are rounded up in Gestapo-like raids and put in cages and deported? I mean, the immigrant rights movement in 2005 was pretty impressive, but you could see something on an even higher scale if he follows through with his promises. Not to mention the disruption that his policies could have on the economy, and again, that's going to affect people very pragmatically. Now, if the Democrats do manage to win the White House, do you think Trump's base is going to take that standing down? A third of the country already thinks 2020 was stolen. Things are going to get very, very interesting. But we, again, have to keep the big picture in mind. I don't think Kamala Harris would get much of a honeymoon, especially after Biden. And another 4 years of the school of the Democrats really could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and people completely losing any and all illusions in that party. And of course, another school of Trump would undermine his credibility as well. So, comrades, we in the RCA, we refuse to resign ourselves to evil, and we're explaining to people that you don't have to choose between Ebola and the plague. These are not the only options for humanity. Trumpism, it's metastasized, it's evolved into something even more dangerous and pernicious than it was in 2015 and 2016, and the liberals have proven their inability to get rid of it at its root, even if they might stop them at the polls. So we have to use the heightened politicization of this election year to raise our banner high and to build with a sense of urgency. We have to explain that the only way to smash Trumpism is through bold class war politics. Now, after Trump was elected in 2016, we wrote on the cover of the paper, "Only socialism beats Trump." After the experience of the last few years, I think we can refine that a little bit and say only class independence, class politics, class war, and proletarian revolution can defeat Trumpism by uprooting its capitalist roots. So, I'd really like to emphasize, comrades, that our perspectives aren't something optional. They're not elective. They're an essential part of our reason to exist as a distinct political tendency. They represent the application of Marxist theory and historical analysis to the phase of the class struggle we're passing through now and allow us to better understand the future that we're headed towards. And as in all turning points in history, we have to go back to the fundamentals so we can understand what we're preparing for, which is the socialist revolution in our lifetime. Over the last few decades, we've accumulated the initial forces, the initial base of cadres, the experience, and the theoretical understanding that's going to allow us to make a serious run at this. But now it's time to invest all of that accumulated political capital into building the RCA. We're done waiting for the labor leaders to come up with something. We're done hoping that DSA could do something, or maybe a left split from the Democrats. Obviously, we need a sense of proportion. We understand that we can't win the revolution with the forces we have now. But we also understand that if we don't get the ball rolling and start building something serious now, no one else will. So comrades, this is what the acceleration of history looks like. These are the times when, you can have weeks or days, you can have decades worth of experience happening, sometimes in just a few hours. If you look around this room, comrades, you will see what the revolutionary future of this country looks like. It comes down to each and every one of us. It comes down to each and every one of you. The potential for the socialist revolution in our lifetime cannot be denied. Every day that passes makes that outcome more and more probable, and the task of the RCA is to make that potential not only probable, but actual.